I think we are live. Welcome, sir, and welcome viewers to the another lecture of our page, Voices into the Past, Otit Prabhav. Today we have with us Dr. Souvik Naha, who is going to give a talk on cricket and the end of the British Empire in India. Certainly, that we are very happy that after a long days, we are able to organize a webinar on cricket. So, as a historian of modern South Asia, Dr. Naha primarily engages with the formation of the leisure cultures and the global and transitional flows of culture. He has used the perspectives of cricket and the mass media to identify the forms of these flows in the context of India. He has written so many writings on sports. His recent publications include a book titled Indian Cricket and the Postcolonial Society, which is yet to be published from Cambridge University Press, and a journal titled Live Sport During the COVID-19 Crisis, Fans as Creative Broadcasters. Besides these, he has excellent writings, journals, edited books on varieties of outstanding topics, which certainly can enlighten us about the different aspects of sports in the world. He is currently working on his European Commission funded postdoctoral project on the role of sport in Britain-India encounters and in the fields of the international politics, migration, cultural exchange after India's independence. And he also serves as the associate editor of Sport in Society, editor of Sport in History, and book reviews editor of Soccer and Society. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome Professor to start our lecture today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Devajyoti, for the very kind introduction. So I thought I would just start with a few words on my line of research and what I mostly do. But since you have covered most of those things very adroitly, let me just jump into the topic of today's discussion. So I've been doing a project which is funded by the European Commission under the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship grants for the last 2 years, which is about the role of cricket and its use as a diplomatic tool in fomenting the relationships between Britain and India, and also to an extent Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So mainly it's about the role that cricket has played in post-colonial diplomatic relationships between Britain and its former colonies. So let me start with a letter which the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee received in September 1948 from one of his Indian friends. So the friend was Paramsivan Subbarayan, who was an Oxford and Dublin educated Indian lawyer. He was also a well-known freedom fighter, and later he was a Congress politician who served in Jawaharlal Nehru's cabinet as a minister. So in the letter to his childhood friend, Subbarayan mentioned two things. Firstly, he resented the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin's comment that the Indian government had used undue violence to annex Hyderabad into the Union of India, which was a burning question of the day. But the letter's main aim was to ask Attlee to restore the Marylebone cricket clubs, that is the MCC's cancelled tour of India in 1949-50. The letter set in motion urgent meetings and correspondences involving the British Prime Minister's office, the Commonwealth Relations Office, diplomats in London and New Delhi, the MCC, the BCCI. It went on for 3-4 months. The Commonwealth Relations Office, which I would abbreviate as the CRO henceforth, it sent a very chastising note to the MCC president, the Earl of Gowrie, at the point. And the letter encapsulated why the apex political bodies in Britain spent months doing multi-stakeholder diplomacy, deliberating over a trip that some English cricketers did not want to make. So the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, Sir Philip Noel Baker, wrote to Earl of Gowrie saying that you are the last person to whom I should dream of addressing a lecture on the value of cricket in strengthening bonds of friendship between members of the Commonwealth. And I will only say that at this peculiarly critical juncture in the development of our relations with India and Pakistan, nothing should be discouraged that can contribute to this end. The MCC had reportedly cancelled the tour due to the shortage of financial resources and the unwillingness of most cricketers to travel to India. As a result, a Commonwealth 11 consisting of players from England, Australia, and West Indies replaced the MCC team and toured India from October 1949 to March 1950. The events galvanized by the letter and many other similar correspondences signpost the use of cricket as a situational diplomatic tool for Britain's bid to retain close ties with its former colonies in the Indian subcontinent. Historians have documented several African countries like Nigeria, Gold Coast, and Uganda sending football teams to Britain in the 1950s, setting a field for cultural fraternization between the old masters and the new inheritors. The English Football Association 11's visit to the Caribbean in 1955 and Nigeria and Ghana in 1958 continued the cultural dialogue. Apparently, the tours helped Africans learn to emulate British political and economic system. In post-war Britain, the tangible benefits of sport for international relations were more recognizable in transnational institutions such as the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. So, in institutions like that, success in sport determined how well the overseas candidates fitted into the academy's life and the respect that they received from their British peers. In 1960, an official British survey of the state of the Commonwealth had described the institution as a vigorous social organism, and it also listed sport as one of the intangible links between Britain and other member states. The report noted that Britain fell short in exploiting the great interest in sport in its former colonies, owing to the lack of bilateral tours with nations in which certain British sports had found mass following. Such statements have generated a perception that Britain did not aggressively use sport to strengthen international relations. In this presentation, based on an empirical analysis of previously untapped archival documents and newspaper reports on India's cricketing contact with England from 1945 to 50, I will argue that contrary to this kind of preconceptions, Britain indeed made a very strong effort to pursue diplomacy in South Asia through sport. I will contend that cricket facilitated a dialogue between British and Indian political establishments and sport federations. And the study of this interaction will deepen our understanding of the end of the British Empire in South Asia. So, this presentation, seeking to analyze cricket's significance as a state-led policy, will make two important contributions to the study of Imperial and Commonwealth history. First, it will reevaluate Indo-British relations from a culturalist perspective, suggesting that culture was an important arena of diplomatic negotiation that historians have largely overlooked. The literature on how India and Britain readjusted their relationship in the decade after India's independence refers to cooperation and conflict in the fields of politics and economy. Historians have addressed how India's membership of the Commonwealth, settlement of the sterling balances, growing bilateral trade, and British investment in India laid the foundation of an amicable relationship. On the contrary, Britain's support for a plebiscite in Kashmir and criticism of India's actions in Hyderabad, the British press's propaganda against India, and British colonial violence in the Middle East, Africa, and East Asia, not to mention the Commonwealth immigration policy, which was heavily against Indians, and Britain's endorsement of South Africa's racial politics and Dutch colonialism, it estranged India from British politics. In a collection of essays edited by Ken Malik and Peter Robb, several scholars have discussed the role of cultural institutions such as the English language and the BBC and other media in Indo-British relations, but none of them have engaged with how this could have any diplomatic implication. So I will try to rethink the nature of Indo-British cooperation and conflict by examining cricket as a forum of diplomacy at both interpersonal and institutional levels. So I will thus aim to provide fresh insights into late imperial and post-imperial diplomacy in the context of decolonization and Commonwealth politics. And secondly, I will try to enhance the existing understanding of the importance of sport in Commonwealth relations and post-colonial cooperation. Most of the historical works on Commonwealth sport refer in particular to Anglo Australian discord in the wake of the Bodyline series or the sporting isolation of South Africa due to apartheid. Cricket or sport in general has rarely received any recognition from scholars of imperial, post-colonial, or international history as a viable means of Indo-British diplomacy. A notable exception to this paradigm is Prashant Kidambi's recent book called Cricket Country, an Indian Odyssey in the Age of Empire. The book has examined the history of early organized cricket in India from the 1850s to the 1910s and the diplomatic potential of cricket matches between Indian and English teams. So I will try to extend the remit of this historiography by examining sport as a cultural form with a political function in post-colonial relations. Uh, as a nucleus of the symbolic construction of post-colonial British and South Asian bilateral politics, cricket offers insights into post-war East-West international collaboration, the creation of a British sphere of influence. It also helps reconsider the process of decolonization in a manner generalizable to the Commonwealth and the post-colonial world in the 1940s and 50s. So in this regard, I will discuss the use of cultural diplomacy as a means to shape a country's international perception and enrich the historiography of state-led cultural missions. So after this long mission statement, let me just introduce very briefly why cricket was always considered as a valuable imperial bond. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, several British Empire builders like politicians, teachers, missionaries, soldiers, and so on, they realized cricket's potential as an ideal vehicle of imperial solidarity. They thought that cricket symbolized England and could serve as a strong cultural bond between the colonizer and the colonized. Colonialism was usually a matter of great pride and confidence for the British ruling elite, and it brought with it a moral obligation as well. The conquerors justified colonialism, saying it was their responsibility to elevate the vanquished races up to the standard of modern civilization. So, sport thus became a part of the British Empire's unofficial civilizing mission and moral training of the debased non white races and marginal whites. Historians have interpreted cricket's diplomatic role in the British Empire as a connect between variously as England, the imperial parent, and Australia, the colonial child, or a cultural bond of white imperial fraternity, or a cross-cultural bond amongst members of an artificial political entity who had little else in common, and finally, as an opportunity to cement the bonds of imperial solidarity and dispel racial discord between Indians and Britons. They have also acknowledged that these connections were largely ideological. British settlers and the indigenous people in the colonies took a different approach to cricket depending on their relationship with the British imperial elite. For settlers, like in those in Australia, cricket was a connection with their home. Unlike the settlers in India, who were more open to local culture, those in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand largely distanced themselves from local influence as well as local cricket. These conclaves of whiteness were commandeered by politicians, military officers, and rich businessmen, which is evident from the titles of the domestic first-class tournament trophies in these countries. The Currie Cup in South Africa was donated by Scottish shipowner and politician Sir Donald Currie, who played an invaluable role in British victory in the Zulu and Boer Wars by facilitating troop movement with its ships. The Sheffield Shield in Australia was named after British Conservative politician Henry Holroyd, the Earl of Sheffield. The Plunket Shield in New Zealand was presented by Lord William Plunket, British diplomat and Governor General of New Zealand from 1904 to 1910. The trophies, the players, the patrons, and the chroniclers of cricket projected an enduring image of cricket as an imperial bond. The British government did not envisage sport as a competition for national pride until the 1920s. In 1929, the Foreign Office's suggestion of sending the country's strongest football teams to European competitions was ridiculed in the press. Observing the propagandist use of sport in Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and the communist Soviet in the 1930s, the Foreign Office as well as the press had a stronger appreciation of sports' political utility. After World War II, the Foreign Office included sport in its cultural relations department's activities due to the latter's pragmatic importance as a confidence building tool. Most government officials still preferred informal conversations rather than a strictly official policy in dealing with politically sensitive international sport. The government also wore non intervention in sport as a badge of honor that differentiated Britain from Germany or Italy. Its insistence that the 1948 Olympics must be organized despite the economic crisis and should reflect well on Britain was a break from this policy. In the 1940s, the British government recognized sports' role in reflecting and in enhancing Britain's prestige at home and abroad. It organized the Olympic Games during a period of crisis and heavy loans from the US, Canada, and the IMF, but cricket was a different matter. As a major symbol of English national and imperial identity, cricket permeated the discourse of the state of the nation in a manner unmatched by other sports. It generated a sense of paternalism and cultural attachment with the rest of the British world, which was a group of insider nations. Athletic competitions with non-Commonwealth nations like France and Germany that did not play cricket, for all the ideological fallout of their history of enmity, could not quite measure up to the popular articulation of cricket's national importance. So popular interest in the Commonwealth Relations Office's cricketing agenda towards the end of imperialism, therefore, had some political and cultural import. Due to its ideological significance, cricket provided a reality check of Britain's place in the empire and the Commonwealth. Most of the politicians around this time happened to be very fond of cricket, which must have helped the cause of cricket to a large extent. British politicians at this time were also optimistic about the Commonwealth. In 1956, Alec Douglas Home, who was then the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, and until now he's the only British Prime Minister to have played first-class cricket, he wrote that the Commonwealth was Britain's answer to American and Soviet power blocs. We have not been very kind to the Commonwealth in our assessment of its impact or its usefulness. One Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth has touted the institution as a painkiller given to the people of Britain with the promise of restoring the imperial heydays, which never happened. And the painkiller was kind of withdrawn in the 1960s as Britain began to consider deeper connections with Europe as more profitable for trade and politics. However, cricket could have been an emotional tool for preserving common ties, as some of the most influential ministers in the Commonwealth countries in the late 1940s were known cricket fanatics. Two of these people were Harvard Ewart, the Australian Minister for External Affairs, who was instrumental in bringing England to Australia in 1947-48, where they played Don Bradman's Australia. The other person was Robert Menzies, who during the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London in 1950 had famously remarked, "If two cricketing countries cannot understand each other, who can?" So he was always eager to build political relationships through cricket. Britain's Prime Minister at this point, Clement Attlee, was also perceptive of cricket's potential for bringing people and countries together. The crowning glory of his plans for cricket was probably his Tichel lectures at the University of Oxford in May 1960, which he concluded with a note on cricket's role in unifying the Commonwealth. The fact that cricket was rarely played outside Britain and the Commonwealth gave him confidence that a small club of cricket-playing nations with a shared history and tradition would form a symbiotic association. One of his successors, Harold Macmillan, played cricket in Oxford. He was known to have made 11 references to cricket during his speech on Anglo-Australian relations at the Australian Club dinner in London in 1962. So it was probably not a coincidence that most India-England test matches until the 1960s were planned or played when Attlee, Macmillan, or Douglas Home were prime ministers. So cricket probably reinforced the Labour Party's disposition to claim India's independence as the party's great achievement, and then the Conservative government's efforts to sustain a relative goodwill between Britain and India that started falling apart in the early 1960s. Indian Prime Minister Nehru was a Boy Scout and played cricket and football at Harrow. He wrote in a letter he wrote to his father, Motilal Nehru, was full of description of cricket matches and also grumbled that he had to leave a perfectly good cricket match to prepare for his entrance examination for Trinity College, Cambridge. This experience had inculcated in him the sense that sport was essential to building character and the nation. Cricket helped him connect with people across political divides. At the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London in 1948, he reconciled with his former Congress colleague and then Prime Minister of the volatile Northwest Province, Khan Abdul Jabbar Khan, who was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's elder brother, over a conversation on cricket. He had made plans for a cricket match between Indian and Pakistani ministers in Karachi, but that did not materialize. Later, he invited the Pakistani government for a match in India, which didn't take place again. In 1954, he was requested to lead a team of Indian politicians to play against a Ceylon 11 skippered by the Prime Minister, Sir John Kotelewala, who again was a huge fan of cricket. He was expected to captain an Indian parliamentary team against the British Parliament, led by the Duke of Edinburgh, who died a few weeks ago, unfortunately. This was to be held during the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London in June 1956. Again, that didn't happen. So Nehru had grand plans for cricket, but unfortunately, most of his plans failed. However, the reports of Nehru's inclination to employ cricket for international cooperation, though they came with a very negligible outcome, indicates the leader's investment in cricket's diplomatic potential. We don't have any evidence to suggest that cricket really helped these political leaders to build personal trust. In a diary of a dinner invitation to Attlee's house in 1945, Robert Menzies did not mention any conversation on cricket or having ever talked cricket with Attlee. Likewise, except one suggestion in a monthly magazine of the English-speaking Union that Attlee and Nehru discussed cricket, references to the two prime ministers speaking about non-political matters are as yet undiscovered. Instead, friendships like Attlee's with Subbarayan's were more useful in resolving stalemates in negotiations between two sport federations through ministerial pressure. Emotions of diplomats have an acknowledged role in international relations. Menzies' autobiography offers a window into his mind for insights into how his perceptions of cricket shaped international competitions, foreign policy, and the groundswell of enthusiasm for the game in his country. As the cricket-loving prime ministers of Britain and India have not left similar memoirs behind, sources for exploring the emotional aspects of their use of cricket as cultural diplomacy are rather inadequate. Instead, the correspondences between British and Indian politicians, government officials, and cricket administrators offer new insights into Indo-British reconciliation in the 1940s. The historian Ronald Ham has made an astute use of cricketing analogy to describe the end of the British Empire. So he writes that either the British were bowled out by nationalists and freedom fighters, or they were run out by imperial overstretch and economic constraints, or they retired hurt because of a collapse of morale and a failure of will, or they were booed off the field by international criticism and especially the United Nations clamor. A combination of the first two, nationalism, fight for freedom, and imperial overstretch, catalyzed Britain's retreat from the Indian subcontinent in the 1940s. The empire's endgame revolved around the clash of the Congress and the Muslim League, while also tenuously keeping Axis soldiers and Indian freedom fighters at bay. From the late 1930s and to the early 1940s, Indian political groups disagreed among themselves regarding supporting the British war effort, protesting British excesses that depleted the region's economic resources, and whether to give importance to religion or secularism as the primary mandate of nationhood. Journals of British viceroys in late colonial India reveal the pressure of resolving the aspirations of Indian politicians and the unsympathetic governments in London. The diplomatic acumen and interpersonal skills of important politicians and government officials were more effective than a grand strategy in the transfer of power from Britain to first India and Pakistan and later to Ceylon and Burma. In the 1940s, Britain's role in the Indian subcontinent was to contend with the alternating currents of war and political moves, constantly adjusting their diplomatic relations to the new political order. In this situation, in April 1945, with defeat writ large upon Germany, the Directorate of Army Welfare in Delhi proposed an MCC tour of India after the Second World War. It reckoned that a cricket series would be a great tonic in the context of post war reconstruction of the military and society, especially for the morale of British troops on active service in India. The success of similar football tours and the well known affinity of soldiers to cricket prompted them to think of a tour of the MCC. So it requested the BCCI to explore the possibility of a first class tour and promised cooperation with the arrangements and the sponsorship of the tour. The presence of English cricketers was supposed to rekindle the British soldiers' connection with home and reassure them of life beyond the war. The MCC's tour of India in 1939-40 was cancelled due to the outbreak of the Second World War. So the BCCI was optimistic that the MCC would undertake the tour after the war. As the war in Europe came to an end in May, BCCI Secretary K.S. Ranga Rao wrote a letter to the MCC Deputy Secretary Sir Pelham Warner, paying tribute to war heroes and requesting a tour to mark post-war resumption of cricket. So, acting upon this letter, the MCC convened a meeting on 11 June in which they discussed the logistics of the tour and decided against it. Uh, they wrote a letter to the BCCI saying that the tour would not be possible, but the disappointment in India was soon put to rest as the MCC invited India in return to be the first team to tour England after the war in 1946. The tour took place in the middle of negotiations between the British government and Indian political parties regarding freedom and anti-colonial riots and communal violence across India. At this time, many Indian nationalists directed their anti-British attitude against cricket as an imperial game that should be abolished. Dr. Balkrishna Keskar, General Secretary of the All India Congress Committee, who wrote that cricket is a game purely English in culture and spirit, and it will never be able to survive the shock of the disappearance of British rule from our country. Many Indians objected to the exclusionary outlook towards cricket as a terrain of political conflict. A person identifying as a plain Indian sportsman wrote that politician Keskar should be told that sport never had any nation. The question of one nation taking its sport away from another never arises, not with sportsmen at least. Nevertheless, most Indian cricket authorities of the time, several of whom were linked with nationalist politics, did not separate cricket from politics. As the Indian team was preparing to leave for Britain in April 1946, they asked the MCC to address the team as India instead of All India, as on previous tours. Some of the brochures of the tour still carried the name All India, but the term India was used in official correspondences and scorecards in recognition of the country's impending political sovereignty. The venues of the matches were free of political disturbances, while the Indian captain, the senior Nawab of Pataudi, stuck to cricket in all his statements to the press. The tour reflected none of the tensions in India about how the Constituent Assembly would write the constitution and so on. Yet it assumed great diplomatic significance as a confidence building measure between Britain and India. As historian Kenneth Morgan has suggested in a rare integration of cricket with political analysis, the tour bound the empire together, slowing down the post war transition from empire into Commonwealth. The imperative of reconciliation behind the tour was evident in the numerous dinners and felicitations for the Indian team. Some of the invitations were from academic bodies such as the Oxford Majlis and the East India Association. In other receptions, the invitees were a carefully selected constellation of government and military personnel who were actively involved in Indian politics and statecraft at some point in their career. The person sitting at the top of the table at the MCC's dinner was Stanley Jackson, who was shot at 15 years ago, former English cricket captain and governor of Bengal. Arthur Henderson, the Undersecretary of State for India and Burma. M.K. Velodi, Deputy High Commissioner for India in Britain. John Littleton, the 8th Viscount Cobham, and also the former Undersecretary of State of War and MCC President. And Roger Lumley, the Earl of Scarborough and former Governor of Bombay. Thomas Brand, the Viscount Hampton, and a former Brigadier General of the British Army in India. The English-speaking Union, an educational charity which was founded in 1918 to promote debate and communication between England and India, mobilized a larger group of influential people in the dinner in honor of the Indian team. Among the invitees were Labour politicians who took the most important decisions for India at the time, such as Prime Minister Clement Attlee, the Secretary of State for India and Burma, Pethick Lawrence, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Albert Victor Alexander, number of conservative politicians and aristocrats, the High Commissioner for India, several Indian princes from Baroda, Jaipur, former Governor General of Punjab, Sir Henry Craik, and many military officers, intellectual, cricket administrators, and journalists. The conversations at the table were not documented, but the presence of influential British politicians and military leaders in cricket probably served to make India feel recognized and celebrated in Britain. One memory of one of the evenings survived. Apparently, Attlee offered Pataudi, who had studied in Oxford and previously played for England, a peerage for promoting friendly relations between the two countries. Pataudi declined, but the offer demonstrates how Britain envisaged the tour to increase goodwill between the two countries. A new challenge arose as India became independent in 1947. It expected an MCC tour to cement the promise of post-colonial cooperation. The cancellation of the tour, which had serious diplomatic repercussions, as have been mentioned before, raised questions about how personal actions and decisions by autonomous bodies could undermine international diplomacy. At the same time, India's tour helped Britain promote a perception that the granting of self-rule to India was a peaceful process, and British benevolence in the colonies created this safe space for cultural exchange. Non-political institutions like the MCC were not so easily amenable to changing its rules regarding eligibility to play international cricket. However, they considered their position in the context of India's independence in 1947 and relationship with Britain till the country's constitution came into effect in 1950. Britain's timeline for the transfer of power to India had moved forward after the Second World War. Burdened with heavy war loans from India and the shortage of British men in the army and the civil services, the Labour cabinet expedited India's independence. They hoped to instate the Dominion relationship envisaged in the late 1930s, expecting India to cooperate with Britain in retaining its other colonies in South Asia. Hence, India, Pakistan, and Ceylon were given the same constitutional status in the Commonwealth as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Britain did not recognize the Republican Constitution for any of the dominions before 1939, considering such administrative structure inconsistent with the monarchic policy of the British Crown as the head of state. This connection supposedly united the decentralized imperial system spread across continents. India was reluctant to accept the Crown's authority, and this threatened to destabilize this underpinning of the Commonwealth. Attlee and Viceroy Mountbatten pressed for India to avow the common bond and abandon the pursuit of a republican constitution. Attlee sent out an emissary before the Prime Minister's meetings in October 1948 to gauge the sentiments of other dominions about India's membership. They all acknowledged that India should be a part of the Commonwealth, even if certain constitutional anomalies needed to be accepted, so long as the existing accord of the old members remained in place. In April 1949, Nehru clarified that India would accept the British crown as a symbol rather than an authority and recognize Britain as no more than the leader of the Commonwealth. Concerned with India leaving the Commonwealth, establishing a group of former Asian colonies united by a common animosity towards the British Empire and severing commercial ties with Britain, Britain accepted India's proposal. Pakistan at this time expected Britain to be grateful for the Indian Muslims' wartime support while displaying a lack of obligation to Britain or the Commonwealth. They had hoped to use the Commonwealth to put pressure on India regarding Kashmir and other disputes, but that was dashed soon after joining, as the organization were made up of voluntary members and had no regulatory mechanism. Muslim clerics identified Britain as pro-India and anti-Islam and consequently pressed the Pakistani government to withdraw from the Commonwealth. So unlike India, the country remained a British dominion until adopting a constitution and becoming an Islamic republic in 1956. The constitutional uncertainty of Pakistani nationhood led to the MCC committing a diplomatic mistake in 1948 that strained Britain's relationship with India and Pakistan. On July 19, 1948, at the first ICC meeting in London after India and Pakistan's independence, the MCC president Earl of Gowrie asked the Indian representatives Anthony de Mello and Pankaj Gupta if India and Pakistan had now separate national cricket associations. Pakistan was still in the process of formalizing a national governing body for cricket. De Mello said that India had invited Pakistan to send a representative to the meeting and help them organize an unofficial tour by the West Indies in 1948-49. Afterwards, the delegates voted in favor of retaining India as a provisional member for 2 years and regarding matches against India up to 1st October 1950 as official. They decided to review India's membership at the end of 2 years or earlier if India left the Commonwealth, which would raise constitutional problems for the ICC because at this juncture, only Commonwealth members were eligible to play international cricket. After the meeting, Lord Gowrie suggested that India should consider forming a combined team with cricketers from Pakistan. De Mello reportedly agreed to the proposal, but the comments soon snowballed into a diplomatic dispute. British diplomats were receptive to the political implication of such careless comments. On 19th of August, the British High Commission in New Delhi sent a letter to Algernon Rumbold, the Assistant Secretary of the Commonwealth Relations Office, expressing concern that remarks about cricket could escalate political tensions among India, Pakistan, and Britain. He informed Rumbold that the Indian High Commissioner V.K. Krishna Menon had spoken to the Under Secretary of State at the Foreign Office, Christopher Mayhew, about Lord Gowrie's unsavory and ignorant comment. He recommended that a person of high importance, such as the Secretary of State Ernest Bevin, who was second in command after Attlee at the time, ask the MCC president not to make such comments in the future. Rumbold responded that he was aware that such a comment was made during the recent ICC meeting in London, and Pakistan too had resented the suggestion of a combined team. He agreed to ask Bevin to write to Gowrie, stating the political undesirability of speculating a union of India and Pakistan for any purpose. The situation was worsened by the MCC's reluctance to tour India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, which was seen in India as a betrayal of sorts since India had toured England in 1946. India started pressing for reconsideration of the tour's cancellation. Subbarayan wrote to Attlee during this time. Attlee received the note and asked Bevin if he should interfere in organizing cricket tours. Bevin advised him to wait for the MCC's response to a communication sent by the Commonwealth Relations Office. So during the next MCC committee meeting, the MCC Secretary Rowan Wright-Carr reported that he took Lord Gowrie to meet the Secretary of State for Dominion Relations and discuss the implications of the tour cancellation. Meanwhile, the MCC had an inquiry from Pakistan about entering the fold of international cricket. At a meeting on 10th January 1949, MCC members discussed the BCCI's request to consider the India tour. They supported their earlier decision and drafted a response saying that a tour would not be possible until 1952-53. They also debated including a reference to India's future in the Commonwealth, but decided against making a political statement. Ridecars sent copies of the MCC's response to the Dominion Relations Office and to the Central Office of Information. Considering the turn of events, Attlee finally wrote to Subbarayan that while he could not interfere in cricket administration, he hoped that the MCC's decision to tour India after 4 years would be satisfactory. Jock Livingston, who captained the side, the Commonwealth 11 that replaced the MCC side, said in an interview that the team had decided calling themselves the British Empire Touring Team. However, the name had to be changed to Commonwealth 11 as India would not welcome a team which was reminiscent of centuries of imperialism and animosity. The team comprised of 5 English, 9 Australian, and 2 West Indian cricketers. In the meantime, our Prime Minister Nehru sent an application to the MCC for honorary life membership. The MCC decided that Nehru could not be an honorary life member because he didn't live in England for a full year, so that precluded him from membership. They called a special general meeting in 2 days to consider adding several new eligibility criteria to the rules of electing honorary members, probably to justify rejecting a candidate of Nehru's stature. The meeting was attended by 225 members and presided by the Duke of Edinburgh, and concluded that honorary membership should be restricted to distinguished cricketers after their retirement from first-class cricket. The lack of the two governments' intervention to remind the MCC of cricket's diplomatic role indicates Nehru's unwillingness to pull strings and the MCC's reluctance to assist in improving Indo-British relations. The archived file in the National Archives queue containing the Attlee Subbarayan correspondence had a cutting of a short Manchester Guardian report entitled England's Gift to Asia. The CRO used the report, which was published in January 1949, to impress the public discourse of cricket as a political tool upon all politicians and cricket administrators involved in discussing the cancelled MCC tour of India. The report was about the upcoming Asian Cricket Conference in Calcutta, to be attended by newly independent India, Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon, and the British Protectorate Federation of Malay. The meeting's agenda was an annual Asian knockout cricket tournament to be held in India for the first 2 years and thereafter rotated among members. This tournament, the newspaper provocatively suggested, would keep the greatest permanent link between England and its former Asian colonies alive. By giving importance to cricket as a strong cultural bond between post-imperial England or Britain or UK and the emergent South Asian nations, it foregrounded cricket as a sustenance for British power. The Guardians was one of the many voices in favor of using cricket to exert a cultural influence that occluded Britain's slipping political and ideological grip over its colonies. In 1950, when the Commonwealth 11 was in Delhi, at the same time as a theatrical company sponsored by the British Council, the Times wrote that the British way of life had received a new lease of popularity in India. The cricket match was apparently very well attended. The presence of the Indian President and Prime Minister, as well as most ministers and government officials at the ground, gave the newspapers confidence that British culture would survive decolonization. In 1953, the MCC erected an Imperial Cricket Memorial at the Lord's Cricket Ground in London in honor of the cricketers fallen in the two world wars. The inauguration ceremony was attended by several Commonwealth High Commissioners and the visiting Australian team. During the opening speech, the Duke of Edinburgh expressed great satisfaction that cricket had formed ties of affection and brotherhood of kindred spirits among Commonwealth countries. Finally, when the playing conditions of a test match between England and Australia in Manchester caused a furore, one concerned cricket enthusiast pleaded to the Daily Mail that the venue be not used in future matches for the good of both cricket and Commonwealth relations. So the Manchester Guardian was not alone or overly effusive in its admiration for cricket's diplomatic potential in preserving the crumbling British Empire. The newspaper had arguably moved to the center of the political spectrum under A.P. Wordsworth's editorship, who was opposed to the Health Minister Annie Bevan and the National Health Service, yet it retained respectability as an independent liberal voice, and combined with the pro-establishment, the Times, or the right-wing and pro-empire Daily Mail, to project cricket as an imperial political force in British public discourse. The word permanent in the Guardian report carries immense symbolism. Even as late as in the 1920s, the British were building huge buildings in Delhi, which are being slowly pulled down now. And the ideologues of the empire, such as Lord Curzon, who was the Viceroy of India, claimed in the British Parliament that the Indian Empire would last another 500 years. In the closing pages of his now classic book on British imperialism in India, Francis Hutchins drew attention to two kinds of Englishmen. One whose identities were informed and lives given meaning by the perceived greatness of the British Empire, and the other who reluctantly served the empire and saw decolonization as a means to connect with India on more equitable and permanent terms. The popular press in Britain continued to project an illusion of imperial power through the 1950s, through the idea of a permanent British Raj, though the idea of a permanent British Raj had more or less imploded soon after India's independence. The Commonwealth was an ideal platform for both groups. So it was a surrogate for empire for some, a partnership of nations with Britain at the center, a reminder of imperial greatness. Others were enthused by the opportunity it gave to forging new relationships and alliances and stay relevant in a changing world. Under Attlee's Labour government, the CRO was an instrument in projecting Britain as a leader in overseas development. The intention did not change under the conservative governments that succeeded Attlee, but ministerial pressure on the MCC evidently slackened until the controversial South African tour of England in 1970. So, in conclusion, let me remind you what the sociologist Maurice Roche said, warning policymakers against attaching too much importance to sport, since sport offers forms of membership and participation in collective action which may be temporarily strong, but which are transient and ultimately weaker and more vulnerable than those on offer in the rest of modern culture, economy, and politics. Aside from making a careful estimate of sports' political significance, one must analyze the interactions between politicians and sport administrators with caution, as the process is largely invisible and often personal, as is evidenced by Subbarayan's letter to Attlee. With due attention to these conceptual challenges, I have tried to show that the overworked history of the British Empire in South Asia can still be enriched through exploration of new avenues such as cricket. Scholars usually attach little importance to sports' ability to command diplomacy, primarily owing to the general lack of visibility of the interaction between national governments and sport federations. The 105th among the 106 recommendations made by an eminent persons group appointed in 2009 to suggest how to revive the Commonwealth was asking national sport federations to commit to strengthening linkages between sport, development, and peace. So this measure was too vague to have any real resonance. So I have examined the beginning of the decolonization phase in the history of the Commonwealth, showing that the use of sport diplomacy was a practice rather than a recommendation or simply an idea. Such transactions undoubtedly had a commercial aspect. India sent 2 lakhs cricket balls and other equipment worth £80,000 for the 1947-48 English domestic season, enhancing its reputation as an exporter of cheap sport equipment. Aside from cricket's value as a trading article, the CRO took an active interest in maintaining contact with the Indian subcontinent through cricket tours, and the MCC revised its rule to grant full ICC membership to Pakistan even before it adopted a constitution. The way the MCC, which was a so-called body of cricket administrators, negotiated decolonization in no uncertain terms, showed how deeply embedded the empire had been in in the fibers of domestic institutions and British social experiences. Politicians, including prime ministers, became involved in the scheduling of tours and negotiating greater recognition for emerging nations, helping Britain maintain a strategic alliance with their former colonies. The chain of events resonated with Britain's post war conviction that the decolonization of India was not a death blow to the British Empire, but rather a reorientation of the imperial political order. Cricket matches with former colonies offered Britain a chance to exhibit its paternalistic commitment to developing backward regions, enabling it to hold a moral high ground over other imperial powers. They also helped Britain project an image of post war domestic recovery and reconstruction. Overall, sporting exchanges were a part of the short lived British triumphalism regarding the country's contribution to the making of a new world war. India's test match tours of England starting from 1932 were arguably part of Britain's diplomacy to gratify India as an important member of the British Empire. Post-colonial tours and the clandestine involvement of the nation state in resolving administrative problems present a more complex landscape of international power relations. In particular, the politics of recognizing the sovereignty of emerging nations. The journey of Indian cricket in the 1940s was thus a process of travel, both in a literal sense, as the country's national team's arrival on the world stage was announced through trips from and to India, and also in a figurative sense, as the nation labored to make itself a visible and vibrant force within the emerging political order. While the story of cricket was not entirely coextensive with state formation in post-colonial India or Britain, the sport constituted a part of their foreign policy, especially in Commonwealth affairs. Cricket not only helped to nationalize the post-independence Indian state, but also established a cultural domain of engaging with other nations. It was fraught with political tensions of the time, which was probably more intense than at any other point in the history of Indo-British relations in the second half of the 20th century. The dialogues between the MCC and the BCCI exhibited the latter's effort to negotiate the hierarchy of cricketing nations. Using cricket as a context of interrogating colonial and post-colonial political relations, I have tried to raise some important questions regarding how politics feed into culture and how culture in turn affects certain aspects of diplomacy. So I've also examined the British people's changing sense of empire and colonialism in the late 1940s, the reinvention of British colonial policy in the wake of decolonization, and the cultural impact of the empire in post-imperial Britain. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an informative lecture. So basically, about the questions, can we move to the question and answer session?
Sure.
Yes. So personally, I have two questions. Okay, let's we get from the audiences. And the first question from audience is from Krishna Mondol. She asks that how can we compare the cricket and the idea of nationalism parallel in case of India?
Okay, thank you, Krishna, for this question. The thing is, it will take several hours to determine how Indian cricket has always been enmeshed or embedded in Indian nationalism. There are several brilliant books written by Ramchandra Guha and Bhoria Mujumdar, Kaushik Bandyopadhyay, and recently Prashant Kidambi. Just to be very brief, at times cricket provided Indians an opportunity to compete against British people on an equal footing, because in the court of law or in any other political and social domains, the British did not always play by fair means or play by the rules, but apparently cricket was one of the sole platforms on which the rule of law actually existed, and Indians could take refuge within, and Indians could try to compete against the British within the legal traditions of cricket and try to beat them. So apparently there were many cricket or football matches in the early 20th century which had nationalist overtones and connotations. So apparently, after a match in which the Maverick cricketer CK Naidu hammered 153 in 2 years against a visiting MCC 11, one of the onlookers was Prem Bhatia, the famous journalist. So he wrote, after having watched Naidu's innings, that each of his 11 sixes felt like a nail in the coffin of the British Empire. So this is how cricket inspired Indians to it just kind of provided Indians a common platform to feel their nationalist feelings, fellow feelings, Indianness, a sense of patriotism, a sense of unity, also a sense of morality. And beating England in cricket and also in other sports, but other sports couldn't really give Indians the same opportunity as cricket did, because that was the most common sport in which India played Britain in the colonial times. So playing against the colonizers gave Indians the feeling that we can do something as a nation. So this is how the association between nationhood, nationalism, and Indian cricket started in the early 20th century.
Okay, so the next question is from Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay. He asks that uh, why now it become difficult to arrange cricket series between India and Pakistan? Is it possible to arrange this in near future? What is your personal view on this?
Well, yeah. Thanks for the very leading question. Again, this is a provocative topic which can raise a lot of storms in a teacup. We haven't played against Pakistan in a proper series for 12 years now. The thing is, it's very difficult to go ahead with the tour without the government's assistance, because it's in the end, it's the national governments of the two countries which have to agree on the logistics of the tour. So I know from various sources, both written and oral, that both the BCCI and the PCB, they are extremely enthusiastic about resuming sporting relations between the two countries. But apparently, the two governments, and especially the Indian government, has put its foot down against any future tours. So I don't really think with the current government in power, we will have any tour of Pakistan or vice versa. So if it's replaced by another government, there might be another story. But again, it all depends on the people in power. So I don't really need to remind everybody that India has a booming trading relationship with Pakistan, and it has actually increased in the last 2 years, just coinciding with the time when anti-Pakistan rhetoric has intensified in the Indian media. So a lot of things go on under the bridge, and cricket is definitely one of the casualties in this conflict between these two countries. But yeah, I'm not very optimistic about it in the near future.
Okay. So the next question is from Professor Sukhdev Sawal. Here is asking that what was the money potential of cricket during the colonial and the post-colonial India? Did the money factor turn corner for cricket among the Commonwealth nations?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's all got to do with money. So cricket was definitely the first sport to be commercialized in India. So even when telephone barely existed in the country in 1916, one could actually dial a three-digit number and ask about the cricket scores in Bombay. So which is kind of unthinkable right now, that even a century ago we had something of this kind for an innovation of this kind for cricket. So afterward, the cricketers were heavily patronized and given sponsorships by different companies. Cricketers had to play for the like various, like Sunil Gavaskar played for Mafatlal, and Air India has been a large sponsor for Indian cricketers and footballers. The tide turned in India's favor on the international stage in the 1980s after India's success in the World Cup, and after that the several uh, wins in Australia and England in 1985 and 1986, then the organization of the Reliance World Cup in 1987. So money started trickling in from the 1980s, and that definitely helped India ascend the hierarchy in global cricket. 1969, so the BCCI asked for £200 from the Congress government, then led by Indira Gandhi. Apparently, the England team, which was supposed to tour India, had asked for a guarantee money of £200. The BCCI didn't have even that sum of money with them at the time, so they were poor. They petitioned Gandhi, but Gandhi told them that I have far better things to think of, and we are not going to give you anything in foreign exchange. So the tour didn't take place, and now English cricketers are in India playing IPL, returning to the country even after a terrorist attack in 2008 to just finish the rest of the tour at the drop of a hat, because money has been one of the biggest lures for them. So playing in India offers everybody a lot of money, and some cricketers have been able to sever ties with the national cricket teams and cricket board just to play in tournaments like the ICL and the IPL when they were first started. So yeah, money has definitely helped India turn a corner in the world, in the Commonwealth, everywhere.
Okay, so personally, I have two queries. The first is you have said about the cultural perspectives in cricket in the 1920s, 1930s, and the post-colonial periods. So my question is that how the religion or the social division played as a tool to create cricket as a unite identity in India in the 1920s, 1930s, or 1940s.
Well, it has always been more divisive than unifying, but there are several aspects to it actually, and it depends on specific people and specific regions. For instance, Gandhi was dead against cricket, firstly because it was an English import, so he was all for disciplining the Indian body through drills and freehand exercises, marching, and all that. But he was dead against team sports like cricket and football because these were invented in Britain. So he was against everything British. So in the tense atmosphere of the early 1940s, when communal riot was just waiting to happen in the corner all the time, Gandhi was dead against communal cricket, so which was the Bombay Pentangular tournament, because all the teams in the tournament was organized along the lines of religion. There was one Hindu team, one European team essentially consisting of Christians, one Muslim team, one Parsi, and one rest, like the Buddhists and Sri Lankan cricketers, and yeah, people like them who didn't really fit into any of these categories. So, according to most Congress politicians who were inspired by Gandhi's teaching, so this kind of polarization actually reflected the broader divisions of religion in the society, and such communal cricket should be banned. There were counter arguments coming from within the ranks of cricketers who played in those tournaments, both Hindus and Muslims, that no, this is a forum for cultural fraternization between us. So this doesn't really polarize, but it unifies us. But there was a poll taken in which the Gandhi-led Congress Party narrowly beat the cricket enthusiasts, and communal cricket was banned for 2 years, 1943-44. It came back in 1945 after the end of the Second World War. So people have had different opinions on this. If you just think of the Pakistani cricket tour of of India, which was their first ever international cricket tour in the early 1950s. So they came here to play 5 test matches. One of the tour matches was in Surat, which was a Hindu majority city, like 87% of the population were Hindus. And that had been a hotbed of communal violence, past, present, and future. So when their train had stopped in Surat, so most of the cricketers were alarmed by loud knocks on the doors of the train. So they were really frightened. So what was the people up to? So one of them just peeked outside the window, and there were like hundreds of Hindus who were gathered in the platform with garlands in their hands. They were trying to congratulate, felicitate the Pakistani team. They were thankful to them for coming to India and playing. So that was one kind of reception. 4 days later, when they went to Vadodara, so there were these Hindu Mahasabha guys who stoned and destroyed the platform raised for the felicitation ceremony, and they made sure that the tour match Pakistan was going to play there did not take place. So you have people of all kinds, and cricket has always been very unifying and divisive most of the time. But in my experience of peering through the pages of newspapers for the last 100 or so years, it has been more divisive than unifying.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And I have another question that is from. We know that cricket is the legacy of the colonialism, or maybe it became a resistance to it as irony. But I have the question that after the in the post-colonial period, after the independence of India, how the friendly tools between the two nations help to create or help to strengthen the political relationship between them in case of India or others countries.
Yeah, as I have said throughout this discussion, that India, between cricket played an important role in cementing some sort of diplomatic relationship between India and England in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it completely disappeared from the 1960s, when the MCC couldn't be just any less bothered about making tours of India, but they did in the end when they were put through ministerial pressure. And disputes arose most of the time. For instance, in 1981-82, the England team had a couple of players who had played in apartheid South Africa, and the Indian government was against the apartheid rule. So the Indian government said they wouldn't want those two cricketers to be here and refuse to clear their visas. So that kind of generated a diplomatic problem between these two countries, but that was kind of amicably resolved. And then the question of India and Pakistan all the time. So cricket diplomacy has blown hot and cold throughout the history of these two countries. Ziaul Haq came to Jaipur to talk to Rajiv Gandhi during a cricket match. Then Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Parvez Musharraf, even they took recourse to cricket to jumpstart the festering relationship between these two countries. But most of the time, it didn't really help. And India got into the good books of South Africa by inviting them to play international matches here starting in Calcutta in 1992. So India has tried its bit in fostering diplomatic relationships through cricket, but most of the time it hasn't really helped political causes or been of permanent usefulness, except for one or two occasions.
Thank you, sir. Uh, I think that I am facing some connectivity issues, or there is a storm around here. So I am concluding here, and thank you, sir. Thank you for such an informative lecture and enlighten us
Thank you so
about
much
this
for inviting me.
wonderful topic. Yes, sir. For the viewers, I have the announcement of our next two lectures. So tomorrow, Professor Osman Boperachi will talk on Hindu gods in Gandharan art, Brahma, Indra, Shiva, Vishnu, and Surya, and it will start from 6 p.m. And another one of Professor Deepak Kumar will talk on scientific temper, the need of the hour. It's on 5th June from 6 p.m. So thank you, sir, and thank you, viewers. It's all for today. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much.